Maida's malice meant that I lost my general English A-level classes as Nerea Muka had picked them for himself and handed me the leftovers. The new A-levels English literature class was as delightful as the group I had lost, but I never managed to develop a lasting bond with them. Among the other cases, I found myself teaching Maida's city-bred nephew, whose parents had decided the best way to curb his bad behavior was to send him to a boarding school in the rural areas. It failed, and to make him even more insufferable, he played up the "my uncle is the headmaster" card. One day in early June, I walked into the classroom and everyone seemed surprised to see me. I had noticed Niramuka lurking in the office next door and not thought much about it. I did a double take and walked back out of the classroom. "So, what's going on?" I asked. "The headmaster wishes me to teach this class from now on," was all the explanation I got. I went home, packed an overnight bag, and began walking towards Madziwa. I stopped and I was offered a ride all the way to Harare by none other than Emerson Mnangagwa, the now president, then the Minister of Internal Affairs, whose purview included the much feared Central Intelligence Organization, CIO. He had just deposited his nephew at Chindanduma because he had not been paying enough attention to his studies in Harare either. We shared many stories on the way down, but he never asked me why I was leaving school on a teaching day. Many years later, I discovered that both Nyasha and Wilfred, whom I had mentioned in the course of our conversations, were invited to interviews with him, and Wilfred was subsequently employed by the minister. I transferred out of Chindanduma and went to Mutumba Secondary School, the village school that we could see perched on the hills high above Madziwa as we waited for the truck to leave on Sunday night. Some months later, I was informed by a breathless Kate that after an incident at Chindanduma, the students had stoned Maida's house. The following day, Fei Chung, the Minister of Education, plus several members of the Mashonaland Central Department of Education Executive, had shown up and convened a meeting at the dining hall with all the teachers, staff, and students required to be in attendance. It was an open forum, and everyone who wished could make a contribution to the proceedings. There was a long list of grievances, including the beating of a much-loved student who suffered from curvature of the spine or scoliosis. It had been a humiliating experience, and at the end of it, they stripped Maida of his post. It is a shame that he has been promoted beyond his capacity, but in times of rapid expansion, mistakes are inevitable. My experiences with the other headmasters in Southern Africa were nothing short of cordial, respectful, and collegial. The transition to Mutumba followed quite smoothly. I was given a letter to enable me to use the Chindanduma truck to load all my furniture and personal effects and transfer them to Madziwa. In the course of a single day, I managed to return from Harare, pack all my belongings, say my goodbyes, and set up home in the living room of the only house at Mutumba that could accommodate it all. My new colleagues were happy to see comfortable furniture, but we had to figure out how to put a string and some curtains so I could sleep and dress with some degree of privacy. This presented a serious challenge. I was faced with cinder block and plaster walls and no electricity, so no possibilities for any sort of power tool. Mr. Chingono of the school, Mr. Fixit, appeared on the scene, summed up the situation at a glance, and returned a few moments later with a pole and some sturdy-looking string. The pole was jammed into the window frame, and the string went through a ventilation grill high up in the wall. Problem solved if one ignored the 30-degree slope, which meant that the sheet I hung kept sliding downhill. In the course of thanking him, I learned from this very talkative and amiable man that he grew the largest, most delicious beef heart tomatoes and sweet corn, as well as the usual greens and maize. Did I need any? Mr. Chingono was our immediate neighbor. In his late 40s, he had a young wife and several children, smiling uh, children who would shyly hide behind his knees every time I went to visit and plumb the treasures of his well-protected garden. At Chindanduma, none of the gardens were fenced in. Here they all were, and for no reason that I could readily make out. The school is located in and around an abandoned Rhodesian army camp. There was even a small fortified rectangle with a concrete bunker inside, which now served as a lockup for the agricultural and technical equipment. Talk about turning swords into plowshares. This was absolutely the case. Overhead, maddeningly, two huge metal towers carrying electrical wires to service distant towns, but not us. The view from atop the earthen walls around the bunker gave one a panoramic view of the surrounding tribal trust lands. Beyond the ragged collection of staff houses, I could see across the valley all the way to Mount Darwin. To the west were the kopjes that marked the Centenary Road past the Howard Institute, and to the south were the hills that harbored the fateful Shashi Pass. I loved coming up to this vantage point, and over time got to see the whole area change colors with the passing of the seasons. With the first rains, the farms were transformed from dusty brown smudges to fields of ripening maize, puffy white cotton, or lush greens where the land was either fallow or forest. Sometimes I watched the land disappearing up behind a veil of grey rain, only to re-emerge basking in sunlight and showing off sparkling and diverse hues of green. In the fall, the corn would turn golden and then bleach white and die off, and the earth would return to dust. It was a familiar cycle, and the local farmers prayed that the green would last longest. This was the erratic rhythm of nature that farmers all over the world listen to by dint of necessity, and they pray that the rains will be enough, that the sun will be there in the right amount, and that the insects and birds will not be too many. For once, I felt I was finally living in downtown Africa, no longer in a secure little suburb on the fringes. Gladys called on me as soon as she heard I had transferred and was looking for someone to wash my clothes. I was fortunate to live in one of the few houses with internal plumbing, as well as a bathtub, which she seemed to think was very satisfactory. I ran into Gladys at the market and also sometimes on my rare visits to the village Chibuku bar. She was in her 30s, strong, and had mastered more English than Mrs. Macarao, who, by chance, also happened to show up a couple of days later, hoping to get the job. Needless to say, Mrs. Nyiramuka left clutching the last $15 from my wallet so she could try selling some more chickens. It is easy to imagine that sleeping in a living room quickly lost its appeal. When I casually expressed an interest in living outside of the school compound, actually in the village, Gladys invited me to become a tenant in her house, as she had several empty rooms. It had been purchased by her husband, but sadly he was killed in a car accident. She was left to look after the house, though only until his relatives decided what to do with it. She could not claim ownership of the house, and the practice was to send the widow back to her parents, to take her children and forget about her. It was also common for the parents to reject the grieving widow, and they would leave her to face life as best she could. Gladys had no children. Her parents were no longer alive, and her siblings were very poor and distant. She lived without knowing what her future held. She lived without knowing what her future held. It was more when than if she would be evicted, and all she could do was to try and scratch a living in any way she could. The invitation was practical, as it would give her rent money. It was a tempting proposition, and I mulled it over. But then the rains began, and I thought of having to arrive at school at 6:45 in the morning, rain or shine. It was a good 45-minute walk, plus I would be carrying class sets of marking. I realized that my cramped living room was perhaps a better place. To her credit, Gladys did try my suggestion of raising chickens. She had a reasonable coop, which she fixed up, and she found a dozen young layers to begin the enterprise. Sadly, in the middle of one night a few weeks later, a cobra found its way inside. When she arrived, having been roused by the noise, only 2 birds were left alive. She could only watch the others die. "I see too many things dying, my friend," she told me wistfully, adding, "and I wonder, when will it be my turn?" The AIDS pandemic was just unfolding, and it was not a good time to be a single, unprotected woman. However, we became good friends, and she continued to wash my laundry and kept me abreast of village events. The students were much the same as they had been at other schools: industrious, polite, and very engaging. Some of them had to walk as much as 15 kilometers to get to school by 6:45, and Mr. Matema would be standing at the gate or nearby with the teacher on duty, checking each student to make sure that they were in uniform. He was very strict about this, but I swear that his heart was every bit as tall as his 5'2" frame. He made each failure his own, and the children loved him for it. He made his staff feel as though they had just given the greatest present ever, when all they had done was to coach his team, the school team. Home soccer matches were played in the village next to the Chibuku bar, so several of the spectators were in varying degrees of intoxication, and the rivalry with Bradley was particularly a partisan affair, but without fail, Mr. Matema was there cheering the team along. I settled in easily with the staff, of whom many were younger than some of the students I had been teaching at Chindanduma. They were called temporary teachers, consisting mostly of O-level graduates, barely ahead of the very students that they were instructing. The ministry treated them appallingly, sending their salaries only after repeated trips to Harare, and usually only in the last weeks of each term. This meant that their money arrived in a lump sum and was gone almost immediately as they paid back their debts and bought some of the essentials that they had done without for weeks on end. They were some of the finest teachers I ever worked with, despite their lack of formal training, and in time, a lucky few were able to obtain scholarships to attend teacher training colleges. The other expatriates were cheerful Mauritians and a former colleague from Chindanduma, Bobby Siva Kumarand, a Tamil from Sri Lanka. David, whom I had helped transfer to Chindanduma, was also there, living in a worker's hut outside the Madziwa clinic. There was an electric light on the other side of the fence, and when it was not raining, David was able to work until late into the night. His progress was remarkable, and he even taught some of the unqualified teachers things that they had not known about in agriculture. Poverty was more of an issue, and I found myself with several students in real need. Rudo was a very special case to me, and I find myself thinking about her long afterwards. Her family lived in nearby Mutumbura village, an even smaller collection of huts and a couple of cinder block bottle stores, some 7 kilometers away. There were years when nearby Mount Darwin cast a rain shadow. The previous year it had been Matumba's turn to feel the effects. The maize was dwarfish and frizzled, and the ground was rock hard, dusty, and inhospitable. Rudo's father could barely afford fees for any of his children, let alone all 5 of them. To his great credit, he saw in Rudo the potential wage earner in the family. She was somewhere around 18 years old, but she wore no shoes. Her skirt was too short for her, and her blue school blouse was virtually transparent. Rudo's quiet determination was powerful, and even though her marks were not outstanding, I began to notice her. She was a natural team leader and loved volleyball. Also, she was a strong long-distance runner. She loved to sing, and she was always there to help out. When assistance was required for special events, Rudo was often the one that administrators, teachers, fellow students turned to first. I was so impressed by her that I decided I would write a personal letter of reference for her at the end of the year. This, I had learned, was considered an invaluable document since white teachers were rare in the rural areas, and consequently local employers took notice when a person arrived clutching such a reference letter in their eager young hands. At the beginning of the August break, I spotted Rudo huddled in a corner in one of the classrooms, her sides heaving and her face wet with tears. "Rudo, what's the matter?" I leaned over and put my hand on her shoulder. "I can't come back next time," she sobbed. "I have to get a new uniform and my parents cannot afford to buy me one." "Oh, is that all, Rudo?" I had been in the village long enough to understand that charity often created obligations and relationships could become complicated, especially in terms of young unmarried women. Would this be constructed, for example, as a down payment on bride price? "I have been looking for a nice chicken for my friends who are coming to see me in 7 days, Gladys. So if you go away, Gladys is away. I need someone to cook for me. I think a chicken costs about the same as a uniform, don't you?" Rudo looked at me as if I were mad. "No, a chicken is only worth $5. A uniform costs 30. "Ah, if it's just an ordinary chicken, it's only worth $5, as you say. But what if the chicken has to be killed and then cleaned and then carried 7 kilometers before it can reach the table? That is several hours of work, wouldn't you agree? And there are laws in Zimbabwe about employers having to pay wages. You see, what I'm asking you to do is to work for me on that special day, and I will pay you for doing this by buying you a uniform." Rudo found this offer hard to believe. Such things never happened to poor girls from Mutambura. While I felt pleased that for a relatively small chunk of my monthly salary, I would be able to make a significant impact on her family's well-being, I could only guess at what was going through her mind. I recall a car arriving from another school loaded with girls about her own age. It had been driven by a married teacher who leered at me as he drove past, and I had watched him pass bottles of Castle Clear beer to the young temporary teachers as the girls exited the car. "You must tell your parents to see me if there's a problem, Rudo. However, it will be my friend's birthday, but in large, often polygamous families, birthdays are not seen as much of a cause for celebration. My friends are visiting me from afar, and I shall be having a small feast for them. A nice chicken would help a lot." All the while, Rudo was slouched at her desk, eyes averted, her dusty arms stained with the tears that had soaked into her sleeves. She looked at me directly, briefly searching, and then away. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "You are most welcome, Rudo. Now go home and feed that chicken. I want her to be nice and fat. No rooster. They may be bigger, but they are too tough to eat." As things turned out, I was invited to travel with my friends, other members of the group that had arrived in Zimbabwe 2 years previously, and we set out in their vehicle before the assigned date. We reached the Great Zimbabwe Ruins and drove along the border with Mozambique in an area known as the Eastern Highlands, where we discovered pine forests, apple orchards, and wheat growing even though Zimbabwe is in the tropics. Carelessly, though, I had not made the effort to get to Mutambura to inform Rudo that I was going away. Back at school, Rudo arrived as arranged with the chicken. Her uniform was there waiting for her. One of the young temporary teachers whose house I had shared instructed her to put on the new uniform in front of him to make sure it is the right size. The chicken, as instructed, ended up on the table of Mr. Chingona, the groundsman, who had helped me construct a barrier against a particular tribal goat. This goat belonged to a neighbor whose property was nearby, as they say. Besides goats, the owner had 9 wives, 56 children, and the only truck in the area. He paid fees, and all of the children attended at least primary school, and several were also my students. Mr. Chipidza also owned a goat. Satan was black and as evil-looking as a goat as you could imagine, and had harvested considerably more produce from my garden than I ever managed to consume myself. It was also the cause of pain in my shoulder that lingered for years afterwards. It was the same shoulder injury that baseball pitchers get, but for me it came about as a result of hurling rocks at the malicious critter. Satan would leap most fences, and it took seconds for him to reduce a patch of rape, lettuce, or tomatoes to mere roots. Chingona's fence had at least ensured that when I returned from my trip, I had fresh greens for the pot. When school started again, I looked for Rudo. To my surprise, she walked past me in her new, slightly too large uniform and gave only a small, shy smile. I had anticipated that I would receive a visit from one of her relatives, as the Shona are fastidious in their acknowledgement of a kindness shown. Soon, however, I noticed that she was participating less in sports activities and hurried home after school each day, rather than lingering to play with friends or catch a pickup ball game. I was not sure what to make of it. At the end of July, David had announced that he was going to take 3 O-levels exams that students normally took 2 years after ZJCs, and even I felt he was being a little overly ambitious. He'd found some old exam papers in the room that housed the school's small library, and decided that he would manage to pass these too. His goal was to obtain at least 6 O-levels and get a place in junior college before his savings ran out. This gave him just 1 more year.